I think we should start.
Yassine?
Yes.
Let Michael say a few welcoming words if you don't mind.
Sure, sure.
Okay.
You can say 10 welcoming words.
I'll say 9.
I just want to take a moment, thank you for your patience, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but we're ready to go now. Thank you all for coming, we're very grateful to the Women and Gender Studies program, to the English department, to the Exile Studies program, to the Betsy Hotel, for all the support that they have given. I'm Michael Gillespie. I just assumed everyone knew me. I direct the Center for the Humanities in an Urban Environment. We have a terrific panel today talking about, I think, a very important question, the tension between totalitarianism and creativity. And we have the Director of Women and Gender Studies to serve as moderator. So I've reached my limit of 9 words. I can say no more. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And he said everything I was planning to say, so the only thing I would say, I'm proud to be part of such a distinguished panel and such a distinguished and important subject, the intellectual and totalitarianism. I am a physics professor, but I'm the director of Women and Gender Studies. So, but one thing I was thinking yesterday, what do I have to say? And then on a Turkish newspaper, I read the president of Turkey said, we only have problems with the educated people. The uneducated and ignorant ones are the ones we like much better. So, with this, I leave the floor to Monika Gustova. She left Prague and now she lived in 1970s. Now she lives in Barcelona, Spain. She's the translator of many major works of Czech fiction. She has translated more than 50 books from Czech and Russian into Spanish and Catalan, and vice versa.
No,
Let's
vice
make
versa,
it,
no.
no. I was just making it more exciting. She regularly writes articles and editorials for El País Spain and La Vanguardia Spain again, The Nation and Lidova Noviny for the Czech Republic. Gustova's most acclaimed books are The Silent Woman, 2005, a novel which encompasses 3 generations of Czech, Russians, and Americans, and Roses from Stalin, 2015, a novel based on Stalin's daughter Svetlana's life story. The second person who we are proud to have is Alejandro Rios, and he's a columnist, film critic, and literary critic at Nuevo Herald. And he works at Miami-Dade College. And we are proud to have Ambassador Martin Palaus, director of the Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy in the Stephen Green School of International and Public Affairs. And he is the former ambassador for the Czech Republic to both the United States and the United Nations. Marianne Demos, one of us, very happy to see you here. She's an associate professor of classical literature at FIU. Her articles have been published in Harvard Studies in Classical Philology, Transactions of the American Philological Association, Classical World, and American Journal of Archaeology. And let's start with our guest, Monika Gustova. Please come here, and panel member will have 10 to 15 minutes. After that, we will have a question and answer, very relaxed discussion session. Okay.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming. Such a beautiful day, and here you are ready to listen to us talking about dissidence. Well, I would like to talk about almost a symbol of dissidency, and that's Solzhenitsyn. So this will be mainly my time. Let me get my bottle of water. At the end of Bertolt Brecht's play, Life of Galileo, there is a brief dialogue in which Andrea Sarpi, one of the astronomer's disciples, said, "Unhappy the land that has no heroes." Galileo replies without hesitation, "No, unhappy the land that is in need of heroes." 20th century Russia, as Brecht's words indicate, was always an unhappy land because it was in need of heroes. In general, heroes there knew they would lose their struggle against the power structures. But they were also aware that their struggle and the fact of losing it was necessary in order to show that human dignity cannot be completely wiped off the map, that human dignity is tenacious. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was one of those heroes, thanks to which, at least in part, the communist system collapsed, both in Russia and in Eastern Europe. But Solzhenitsyn wasn't always a hero. There was a before and after in Solzhenitsyn's life. His arrest marked his transformation into an intellectual obsessed with truth. His obsession made him into one of the world's best-known dissidents and made it possible for him to write A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the Gulag Archipelago. It was essentially his stay in the Gulag which turned him into a rebellious dissident who told the truth, his truth, the one he had experienced, to everyone. He had an experience very similar to Dostoevsky, and it was imprisonment in Siberia that was the turning point for both of them. And it was afterwards that they became powerful writers. A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, perhaps Solzhenitsyn's best and most effective novel. I would say it is. It's about a day in a gulag. It's neither worse nor better than other days, just one normal, regular day. Like James Joyce's Ulysses, like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and like Marina Tsvetaeva's poem of the end, one day represents the entire life. Life is reduced to a single day in which every detail is experienced to the limit. All the details of camp life. It is both a lyrical and a narrative exploration. It was written at the end of the 50s, and in 1961, Solzhenitsyn sent Ivan Denisovich to the editor-chief of the magazine Novy Mir, the poet Twardowski, who after reading it said to his staff, "I have just received a manuscript from a new Gogol." The editor did his best to convince the powers to authorize the publication. It wasn't easy until it reached Khrushchev. He read it, he was interested in it, and it fitted in with his policy of de-Stalinization. And so he told that the publication should go ahead. When it was published in 1962, it met with mixed reactions. like fireworks in a dark sky, everybody was commenting on the book. The people who had been in the Gulag would say, actually, the experience in the Gulag is much harsher, much more difficult, much more terrible than what Solzhenitsyn is describing here. Whereas other people didn't really know anything about the labor camps in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and this will neither Russians, and especially in the West, it was something, the notion of labor camps in the USSR was virtually unknown. And so really the book caused an immediate sensation in the within the USSR and in the world. Solzhenitsyn, after that, started publishing. He couldn't publish after that easily, other than some stories. He couldn't publish very easily in the USSR because Khrushchev was replaced by the Troika led by Brezhnev, and the times changed completely. So Solzhenitsyn started publishing in samizdat, which were copies which circulated in Russia, and in tamizdat, which is like the literature that's printed in other countries. Solzhenitsyn's publisher was in Germany, and it was the journal and publishing house Grani. Solzhenitsyn worked on his books in remote places because he wanted to avoid surveillance. These places were only known to his closest associates. He would leave his first wife alone for whole weeks and even months. So writing was the only activity for which he sacrificed everything, even his private life. And his marriage broke, of course. In 1965, there was a serious persecution, and many of the manuscripts of Solzhenitsyn were confiscated, just as it had happened before to Vasily Grossman. At that time, actually Solzhenitsyn was contemplating suicide, but he worked for 16 hours. At that time, he was working for 16 hours a day on the Gulag archipelago. After having published a day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, the zeks, which means the ex-prisoners, came to see him and told him their stories and experiences concerning the Gulag. Of course, at that time, there were no archives about the Gulag, about the labor camps. So Solzhenitsyn started to build up his own archive. And that's how he wrote his Gulag archipelago. At the time when he was writing, the authorities didn't suspect that he was writing an exhaustive compendium and analytical chronicle of the Soviet penitentiary system. Otherwise, they would have confiscated the manuscript, all the 1,500 pages of it. When he finished the Gulag archipelago, it was the 50th anniversary of the Soviet Revolution and the 100th anniversary of the invention of barbed wire. Then in 1970, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature for the ethical force with which he continued the Russian literary tradition. That's how it was described. There were storms of negative reactions in the USSR, and so Solzhenitsyn didn't even go to Stockholm to get the award because he was afraid that he wouldn't be allowed to to go back to his country. So he only sent his speech there, where he said, the aim of the artist is to feel more sharply than others the harmony of the world and its beauty, and to protest against what men have done in it, and to write down this message for everyone else. By beauty, he meant truth. Just like Dostoevsky also used the word beauty in this sense. The well-known the well-known sentence from The Idiot: "Beauty will save mankind." That's an example of this. Also, in the novel speech, he ended with the Russian proverb: a word full of truth carries more weight than the whole world. So you can see by all this that the word truth is always repeated in his speeches and in his worldview, right? That's like the most important thing to him. By then, the West also was waking up with regard to the Soviet regime. Before that, there was like an infatuation with the left-wing Western intellectuals had like an infatuation with the Soviet Union and with the communist regime. But by then, it was really impossible because, let's see, the process might have been like this, as I see it. There was Hannah Arendt's Treaty of Totalitarianism, which came out in the 50s. Then after that, in around 1960, Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago came out, and the movie was made, which was very, very popular, and people started doubting whether it's such a wonderful fairy tale, the communism in the USSR. Then there was Solzhenitsyn's Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. After that, at the end of the 60s, Stalin's daughter escaped to the West. There was another shock. In the 68, there was the occupation of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet army. And in the 70s, the Gulag Archipelago. So the West was kind of waking up from their love story with Soviet communism. Solzhenitsyn achieved what he had set out to do: tell the whole world about the Soviet penitentiary system, about the tens of millions dead. So there is a long list of less well-known dissidents. After that, there started to be many dissidents, and I'm sure my colleagues are going to talk about this. In Poland, there was one of the dissidents was Adam Michnik. In the Czech Republic, everybody knows Václav Havel and many others. And in Hungary, there was George Conrad. And so there is like a much longer list of not very well-known dissidents. But these are unknown heroes who, according to Brecht's idea with which we began, Russia needed then, and the whole world continues to need today. Thank you.
Now we will have Alejandra Rios. Thank you.
I appreciate the invitation. When Sebastian Arco called me, I told him that I'm not a professor. I work at Miami-Dade College, but in the Media Relations Office. I know a lot about Cuba. That's my topic. I'm going to try to, I brought, if it comes out. Okay. There's a poet in this, there's a filmmaker called Miguel Coyula, who did Memories of Development. Because in 1967, 68, I don't remember quite well, Tomás Gutiérrez Alea did a classic Cuban film called Memories of Underdevelopment. So this guy lived here in the United States, he returned to Cuba, and he interviewed this poet that we're going to see, Rafael Alcides, almost 80 years old. He was part of the generation of the 50s. These are the people who came to write the intellectual that came with the revolution in 1959. And he taped 4 hours, don't be scared, it's only 5 minutes. And he divided the interview in vignettes of 5 minutes, wonderful vignettes of this guy. And more or less what I'm going to tell you after this is something similar. So I want you to hear him, and after that I'm going to make some comments. Doesn't have. This is a really sad story. It's not, we don't have these big heroes like the one that Monica talked about. Actually, I remember in the 60s when I read, I was really young when I read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, because there was some kind of hope in Cuba. They published the book, but after that, that was censored. This poet has returned all his medals, his awards, everything that the government gave to him. This other filmmaker lives over there. He used to live here in the United States. He returned to do some things like this. The PM reference is the first act of censorship that Fidel did. It was a short documentary called PM. It was about the Cuban nightlife, only 12 minutes, and they thought it wasn't like reflecting what was happening, the revolution, the militia on the streets and all that, people drinking, having a good time. They don't believe in good times, people drinking. So the documentary was shown on TV, and then it was shown on a theater, I understand, and then it was simply censored. And that was the cause that Fidel talked to the intellectuals. He doesn't really like to deal with intellectuals. It's not his comfort zone. So you saw Raul the other day, Raul Castro the other day with Obama. You understand it's not their comfort zone. When someone asks things, when people think. So they, he spoke with during 2 days with Cuban intellectuals. And the famous phrase that he said, inside the revolution everything, outside the revolution nothing. And that actually, until today, is the cultural politics of Cuba. If you want to deal with culture, that's the way it is. Yesterday you saw President Obama in this beautiful theater. I want to call your attention about there was no writer, no poet, no artist, only a blind ballerina that has 95 years old, that has done a lot of damage to other ballerinas. That was the only one that approached the President of the United States, because the Castros had a national poet, but he died many years ago. That was Nicolás Guillén. So actually, and the only person that Fidel Castro trusts as an artist was someone that wasn't from Cuba. It was Gabriel Garcia Marquez from Colombia. He didn't trust any filmmaker, any writer, no painter from Cuba. But we had our small heroes. We had someone by the name of Nicolás Guillén Landrian, who made fun of Fidel Castro with a documentary called Café Arábiga, where he puts this music of the Fool on the Hill, and we see Fidel Castro going to his eternal scenario to make a speech. But in the soundtrack, you hear the Fool on the Hill. He was sent to prison, for sure. We had Eberto Padilla, who wrote an incredible anti-Stalinist book of poetry. He went to prison, and they even had him do like a public, he had to retract from everything he wrote and he said publicly, like Stalin did. So it's a sad story. It's a really sad story what happens in Cuba with intellectuals. I think we are in the worst moment, because there used to be people like Nicolás Guillén Landrian, like Eberto Padilla, like famous painter. I can think about Humberto Peña and Raúl Martínez, and theater writers, René Ariza, who died here in exile and also was in prison. But the conclusion is that it's really, what is happening over there, it's simply terrible. I recommend a book of Guillermo Cabrera Infante. I haven't touched people who are in exile. That's another story. But Guillermo Cabrera Infante, quizás maybe the most important novel writer of Cuba, they published a book recently called Mapa Dibujado por un Espía, a map that a spy draw. That is simply incredible. I couldn't believe it was about the 60s, and the repression began really early. It wasn't something that came after that. It was really, really early. The guy tried to return to Cuba. He was a diplomat. He returned to Cuba because his mother died, and then he got trapped. They didn't let him go. So they made him suffer before he could leave Cuba. So more or less, I will, after this, if you want to ask something more about what I've been saying and other experience, I will really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Now, Ambassador Martin Palos.
Thanks for having me. I'm most likely a late addition to this project, but anyway, I had no idea what the context of this discourse is going to be. Let me try to put it very briefly into a broader historical perspective. Totalitarianism is a concept that emerged in the 20th century. Obviously, there were autocratic regimes of different kinds before, but the debate on totalitarianism started only in the 20th century, and it's certainly connected with the emergence of totalitarian systems. Giovanni Gentile was, I think, the first Italian man who first coined this term, totalitario, was connecting it with Benito Mussolini's resistance to the results of the First World War. The First World War caused something in Europe that then, in a way, opened the door for the emergence of all three totalitarian regimes as we know. You mentioned Fidel Castro's, I would say, applause for revolution. It reminds me very strongly of Mussolini's definition: all within the state, none outside the state, and none against the state. So this was very clear, and we can find similar tendencies in Germany. Obviously, we don't need to speak about the Stalin's Soviet Union. So there was a first generation of intellectuals. Most of them refugees and exiles turned into cosmopolitan intellectuals that started their fight against what they experienced at home. So I can give you a long list of names just to look at that. Arthur Kessler could come to one's mind, George Orwell, Ignazio Silone, Albert Camus, and many philosophers, obviously, Karl Meinheim, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Herbert Marcuse, Mark Horkheimer, Franz Neumann, Sigmund Neumann, Emil Lederer, Karl Popper, and even Leon Trotsky can be labeled as one of these intellectuals. You know his story in Mexico, where he was assassinated by agents sent there by Stalin. So we have this story, and what is interesting, one American author pointed out that these public intellectuals by the American academia, I think, is heavily influenced by a whole generation of these people. They actually, because they were trying to fly from Germany, so they ended up here and created schools. I think Alan Bloom once mentioned that in his famous book about Closing of American Mind, the role of these Europeans who came here in resistance against totalitarianism. And one of American scholars even said that they invented on this occasion a specific genre. He said political book combining history and political criticism. It's important to realize that totalitarianism was not only condemned by all these enemies, but served them often also as a new and shocking source of their inspiration. The totalitarian world was phantasmagoric, it was a living nightmare, but still it could not be written off as unrealizable. It seemed literally to defy comprehension. It was confusing not only to its protagonists, but to its victims and potential victims as well. A disturbing question indeed raised and developed later by Hannah Arendt was coming back again and again. What is the nature of this monstrosity? How can anything like that come into existence in the human world? Who are those who were able to come up with the idea of final solution? What state of human mind can bring into existence and keep in operation a bureaucratically organized and technologically advanced system of death factories? So there were a lot of questions that inspired people to write their things. I have 10 minutes, so I have to go forward. I'm going to put into this context two Czech examples from later period of totalitarianism. First will be Václav Havel, and second Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, because it was their cooperation in Charter 77 that I think is something what should be studied as a confrontation of intellectuals and totalitarianism in our Czech context. And let me, I'm always doing mess in my papers, yes, but I know what I want. Václav Havel was very much interested in a fascinating transformation of totalitarianism he experienced in his own life. Because totalitarianism is not only how it was presented in its first original version. Defining features of totalitarian regime was the combination of idealistic hopes for a better world with the use of brutal force and physical violence. The words of Václav Havel. In the 50s, there were enormous concentration camps in Czechoslovakia, filled with tens of thousands of innocent people. At the same time, building sites were swarming with tens of thousands of young enthusiasts of the new faith, singing songs of socialist construction. There were tortures and executions, dramatic flights across borders, conspiracies, and at the same time, panegyrics were being written to the chief dictator. And something changed, and in our case, it was very clear distinction between totalitarianism before 1968, maybe the 50s, before 60s, and after 68. And here, that's what Václav Havel is doing. And this is actually interesting. You have a perspective on totalitarianism from the outside and also from the inside. So I think this was the case of Russian examples. Orwell once wrote a beautiful short essay called Reports from the Inside of the Whale. So I think that this is exactly what you have. And Václav Havel says this second version of totalitarianism depends on manipulatory devices so refined, complex and powerful that it no longer needs murderers and victims. Even less does it need fiery utopia builders spreading discontent with dreams of a better future. The epithet real socialism, which this era has coined to describe itself, points a finger at those for whom it has no room, the dreamers. And then a beautiful description how this worked in Czechoslovakia. It is not true that Czechoslovakia, this was written in the 1980s, is free of warfare and murder. The war and killing assume a different form. They have been shifted from the daylight of observable public events to the twilight of unobservable inner destruction. It would seem that the absolute classic death, of which one reads in stories, and which for all terrors it holds, is still mysteriously able to impart meaning to human life, has been replaced here by another kind of death. The slow, secretive, bloodless, never quite absolute, yet horrifyingly ever-present death of non-action, non-story, non-life, and non-time. The collectively deadening, or more precisely, anesthetizing process of social and historical nihilization. This nihilization annuls death as such, and thus annuls life as such. The life of an individual becomes the dual and uniform functioning of a component in a large machine, and his death is merely something that puts him out of commission. So this was the description, and then Václav Havel's hesitation in the end of piece I just was quoting from. And attempting to say that the struggle of the story and of history to resist nihilization is in itself a story. and belongs to history. It's our special meta-story. We don't know how to talk about it because the traditional forms of storytelling fails us here. We don't yet know the laws that govern our meta-story. We don't even know exactly who or what is the main villain of the story. It's definitely not a few individuals in the power center. They are two victims of something larger, just as we are. It is clear we must tell the story of our asthma, not despite the fact people are dying from it, but because they are not. One small detail remains: we have to learn how to do it. I think this was one of the questions that inspired people for certain type of resistance known as human rights defense in our part of the world. And in this search, I think what played an important role was philosophical perspective. Here, I have no time to make the case clear, but the question raised by philosopher Patočka, who was also in the same situation as Havel, and actually they met and they became, as the first spokespersons of Charter 77, is worth mentioning. So I will end up, because I've already taken my time, with a couple of quotations from Patočka from this period before he became the spokesperson for Charter 77, and then passed away after weeks of brutal police interrogations. He was also speaking about the current system and about the strategy, as he said, to extinguish in advance the smallest glimmer of mobilizing social initiative, mobilizable social initiative, to deprive society entirely, almost entirely, of its moral strength, its external physical capacities, and nonetheless allowing at the same time its external physical capacities to grow. The form of government established in the process bluntly characterized as normalization was bluntly characterized by Patočka as human machinery of decline and degeneration. What could be seen in action here was, according to him, fear, disorientation, vials of comfort, possibility to gain advantages in the environment of general scarcity, creating here an artificially interconnected complex of motivation. And then the Patočka's philosophical resistance. Human reality is always situational. When reflected upon, it changes thanks to the very fact of reflection, becoming at least partially clarified or on the way to clarification. People trapped by a calamity are in very different position when they give up and when they don't. The man who is finding himself in a desperate situation still has different options how to behave. And the way how Patočka and other people like Václav Havel behaved is, I think, the answer to the question. And let me to finish just with a short definition what Jan Patočka thought was human rights. And this was, I would say, epitome for the intellectual resistance. The idea of human rights is nothing other than the conviction that even states, even societies as a whole, are subject to the sovereignty of moral sentiment. That they recognize something unconditional that is higher than they are, something that is binding even on them, sacred, unavailable, and that in the power to establish and maintain a rule of law, they to seek to express this recognition. So I think that intellectuals have power to remind people the truth of which we are all in some sense aware. And these truths sometimes bring people to troubles, and sometimes they can produce results and maybe even make revolutions. Thank you.
So our last panelist, Marianne Dimos.
I would like to thank all the sponsors of this event, especially the Václav Havel Institute for Human Rights and Diplomacy, the Center for the Humanities in an Urban Environment, the Betsy Hotel, the Women's Studies Program, and the English Department. I owe special thanks to Professor Asher Milbauer, the Director of the Exile Studies Program, for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. It is an honor to be among such distinguished panelists and to have the opportunity to discuss a topic that is as relevant today as it was in classical antiquity. I dedicate this presentation to the memory of Mr. Julius Papp, my first Latin teacher, who had suffered in a Russian gulag. He had been a Hungarian journalist who ended up in Russia, finally was released, emigrated to America, and was able to return and died in his homeland. Exile is a complex subject, and I must confess, I think that it is difficult to discuss it in a scholarly forum attended by those who have first-hand experience of exile in one form or another. Exile is usually associated with great suffering, even though it can culminate in the saving of lives and the opportunity to lead a new life free from the threat of persecution. One need only look at recent events around the world to be reminded of this. Exile is an ordeal. It is for this reason that ancient Greek mythological heroes often experienced exile as an agon, the Greek word for ordeal, from which the English word agony is derived. At the end of Homer's Iliad, the epic hero Achilles makes the tragic observation that wandering around the earth, dishonored by the gods and by men, is one of the greatest evils that the god Zeus can bestow upon mortals. Echoing a sentiment similar to that of Achilles, the chorus of Corinthian women in Euripides' tragedy Medea, upon learning of Medea's banishment from Corinth by Creon, the city's ruler, exclaims, "O my country and my home, I pray I never lack a city, never face a hopeless life, one filled with misery and pain. Before that comes, let death, my death deliver me, bring a fatal end to all my days. For there's no affliction worse than losing one's life." I've used Ian Johnston's translation. Clearly, the physical and psychological ordeal of exile is a major theme in extant Greek and Roman literature. The hero often incurs the wrath of a god or goddess who forces the hero to wander for an extended period of time. Heracles, the famous Greek hero, is forced to travel away from his home and to perform 12 superhuman labors because of the malevolent designs of the goddess Hera, his stepmother. Hence the meaning of his name, Heracles, the one who gains his kleos, or fame, from his divine antagonist, Hera. Kleos means glory, or more precisely, immortalization via literature. Greek tragic and epic poetry are full of references to the exile of heroes, such as Odysseus, Antigone, Oedipus, Philoctetes, and Medea, to name just a few. Their subsequent glory, like that of Heracles, is to a great extent a result of their experience of exile. The theme of exile in myth is a reflection of actual historical situations involving voluntary and involuntary banishment. In addition to the mythical heroes mentioned in classical literature, a great number of historical personalities and entire communities experienced exile in ancient Greece and Rome for a wide variety of reasons. In ancient Greece, exiles seeking asylum were viewed as suppliants who needed Zeus's protection due to their perilous status. Sometimes city-states would welcome entire emigre communities. Athens, for example, welcomed the refugees from Plataea, whose city-state had been conquered by the Thebans, even if the Athenian motivation was geopolitical rather than religious. Geopolitical considerations sometimes led to the reverse, the forced expulsion of entire populations. Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War has many examples of this practice. In Athens, there were many prominent political and intellectual members of the city-state who experienced voluntary or involuntary exile on religious or political grounds. Themistocles, Hippias, Alcibiades, Anaxagoras, and Aristotle, to name just a few. Aristotle himself, in the Constitution of Athens, mentions an institutionalized form of banishment introduced by Cleisthenes in 508 BCE and first used in 487 BCE against the Hipparchus, the tyrant.
Ostrakismos, from which we derive the English word ostracism, was a legal mechanism to banish individuals, usually politicians, from the Athenian city-state for a span of 10 years. Once the 10 years had passed, the exile could return to the city-state without a loss of honor and with his citizen rights still intact. Archaeological evidence in the form of ostraka, or potsherds, attests to this institutionalized type of exile. Many excavated potsherds, inscribed with the name of the Athenian general and statesman Themistocles, have been found on the site of the Stoa of Attalos in Athens. An interesting side note about this discovery: many of the potsherds appear to have been inscribed by a limited number of hands. In the case of the ostracism of Aristides, commonly known as Aristides the Just, Plutarch provides a humorous anecdote in his biography of the famous politician. An Athenian citizen, voting to ostracize Aristides, said, "I don't even know the man, but I'm tired of hearing him called everywhere the Just." He unknowingly was talking to Aristides himself. In addition to the political uses of exile, there were also religious rituals involved in banishment. A scapegoat, or pharmakos, could be sent into exile to purify the community in times of a crisis brought about by war, famine, or plague. The expulsion of the scapegoat was thought to cleanse the city of the communal pollution, miasma, brought about by his presence. Another type of exile was the voluntary departure of a defendant who was found guilty of a capital offense in a law court. This practice was not uncommon in Greece and Rome. Socrates, sitting in jail awaiting his execution, famously refuses this option when it is proposed by one of his friends in the Platonic dialogue entitled The Criton. Socrates preferred to drink the fatal dose of hemlock rather than leave Athens, the city that had been his home for his entire life. His being sentenced to death at the age of 70 by a jury of fellow citizens in the Athenian, quote, democratic city-state is a frightening reminder that a state, regardless of its political structure, can have the power to destroy those it regards as threats to the status quo, even if their so-called crimes are minor or fictitious. Socrates' practice of philosophizing, or more precisely, asking influential members of the city ethical questions in front of a crowd, was viewed by his enemies as a crime, which corrupted the youth and challenged the city's official religion. Doubtless intellectuals, then and now, are favored targets of those in power who do not like the examination or questioning of their society's norms and values. The history of ancient Rome also has its share of exiles. The long list includes famous Romans such as Cicero, Pompey, Cato the Younger, Seneca, and Ovid, among others. Since the topic of our panel today is the relationship between the intellectual and the totalitarian state, I shall focus upon the Latin poet Ovid. He stands out as perhaps the most important paradigmatic figure in the history of the literature of exile, because he talks at length about his banishment from Rome by the Emperor Augustus. He became a victim of state censorship. His works were banned from public libraries. Private copies were read in secret and not openly discussed. Ovid often plaintively describes himself as an exile, in his Tristia, sad poems, and in his Epistulae Exponta, letters from the Black Sea. His punishment was technically a milder form of exile, known as relegatio, relegation. As a relegatus, Ovid retained his property and citizen rights. It is astonishing that a poet of Ovid's stature and popularity was banished from Rome in 8 CE. He was 50 years old when, according to what we can infer from his own account in the Tristia and Epistulae, he was summoned by the Emperor Augustus, tried and condemned in private, and sent to Tomis, a Roman port city on the Black Sea now known as Constanza in Romania. The poet describes Tomis as a cold, bleak place, barren of the civilized arts of Rome, and populated by those who speak Getic, a barbaric tongue, he said, which he did not understand. By the time of his banishment, Publius Ovidius Naso had published such works as the Amores, a collection of love elegies, the Heroides, verse poems he imagines that forlorn mythological heroines would write, and his magnum opus, the long narrative poem entitled Metamorphoses. He also had written a witty parody of didactic verse, the Ars Amatoria, the art of love, that is, a handbook for lovers. Although it was published 6 years before his banishment, Ovid states that it was this work, the Ars Amatoria, along with an unspecified, in Latin, error, blunder, mistake, that led to his relegation. He says in the second book of his Tristia, quote, I remember Caesar vividly my offenses, both my crime and my blunder, and diffidently I advert to those delicate subjects, or any weight, to the one, the matter of public record, my literary offense, my quote, dirty book. I've used David Slavin's excellent translation here, and I will use it again in my next quotation. The Ars Amatoria's risque subject matter was not in keeping with the spirit of the moral legislation passed during Augustus's rule. The first emperor, with the help of the Roman Senate, had made adultery a private and public crime in his Julian laws, the Leges Julii of 18 BCE. These laws also encouraged marriage and procreation among the upper echelons of Roman society. Patricians, as guardians of the old-fashioned gravitas and pietas, religious dutifulness, that had made Rome a great empire, were expected to behave as role models. Ironically, Augustus' own daughter Julia flagrantly violated the law prohibiting adultery. Augustus confined her to the island of Pandateria in 8 CE, the same year that Ovid was banished. She was allowed no visits by men, and she was not allowed to drink wine. The sources suggest that she may have been starved to death. Since her exile occurred during the same year as Ovid's, it has been suggested that he was either a party or a witness to her adulteries. All of the theories pinpointing the exact nature of the so-called blunder responsible for his banishment are purely speculative. Although he never specifies the exact error or blunder that causes his banishment from Rome, Ovid clearly portrays himself as a victim of a great injustice. He repeatedly proclaims his innocence and protests that his punishment is too severe, since his wrongdoing was unintentional. He plays with the similarity of the Latin word for exile, exilium, to the word for destruction, exitium. In the Tristia, sad poems, Ovid often appeals directly to Augustus for forgiveness, clemency, or at least for relegation to a place closer to Rome. He was never allowed to return. He died in Tomis around 18 CE. His poetic persona in the works written during his exile displays a convoluted mixture of despair, resignation, entreaty, anger, and defiance. In my opinion, one of the most moving and memorable of the exile poems is the one written for his stepdaughter Perilla, who was still in Rome. In this poem, the seventh in Book 3 of the Tristia, Ovid has an imaginary conversation with his own poem. He treats his creation as a personified messenger whose task is to express Ovid's love in words of wisdom to his stepdaughter. Here is an excerpt, again from David Slavin's translation. Tell her I live as I do not wish to live. Let her know I have returned to the muses, for whom I suffer, informing my thoughts and words with elegy's measure. Ask her whether she still makes verses the way I taught her, or better than I taught, for my example would not be apt to encourage even another sapling. I used to read her admirable poems. She may have given it up, but tell her to persevere and work her talent, if only she keeps away, as anyone clever would, from didactic poems of love. Let her not feel any chilling effect of these cold winds, nor suffer the burden of my exile. Speak to her. Tell her, keep at it, my girl. Return to a noble art. Offer your efforts tribute. Your beauty will fade. That smooth face show lines the years will etch, and then engrave deeper and deeper upon your remarkable brow. The treasures of youth, time, that stealthy thief will come to pilfer, and you will no doubt hear someday somebody say, she was gorgeous once, and stare into your glass and full of grief, agree. Now you have money. Think how fortune's caprice can beggar even a crisis. Of what you had and even of what you are, know that nothing remains. That even the physical world shimmers, changes, one dream giving away in the restlessness of the world's sleep to another and worse dream. It's only the blessings of heart and mind that ever endure. In those you should put your trust. I offer my own example. You know how much I lost when I was sent away into exile. Ruined. But see what I still have, my mind, my work. Unless he puts me to death, not even Caesar can take this from me or banish me from this. And even then, the work would keep alive the best of what I am to survive at home in the minds of those who love me. Think how the grave yawns and gobbles everything else. Save what you can. Clearly, Ovid is aware of the power of poetry to immortalize its creator. The Emperor Augustus, the son of a god, the deified Julius Caesar, had the power to make Ovid suffer. In this respect, he is similar to the Olympian gods, who are divine antagonists of the famous epic and tragic heroes. Nevertheless, Ovid has a greater power. His poetic artistry and a knowledge that his works will survive for future generations to appreciate. Like the Greek heroes to whom he compares himself in the poems written in Thomas, Ovid, likewise a victim of injustice, will not suffer without some sort of future compensation. He defiantly predicts his future glory. One of the Latin words for poet is vates, translated as prophet. Ovid was truly prophetic if we look at the impact that his work has had on generations of writers. The last few years in particular have seen a resurgence of scholarly interest in the reception of Ovid's exile poetry. Noteworthy in this regard are Theodore Ziolkowski's book entitled Ovid and the Moderns, and Jennifer Inglehart's 2,000 Years of Solitude, Exile After Ovid. They remind us that writers opposing autocratic regimes have been especially attracted to Ovid's account of exile. In Russia, for example, the poets Alexander Pushkin, Osip Mandelstam, and Joseph Brodsky treat Ovid as an archetypal figure whose experience of exile they compared and contrasted with their own. Ovid's exile is a topic that has also inspired novelists. Volker Ebersbach published The Exile of Thomas in 1984, and Christoph Ransmayr published his novel, The Last World, in 1988. The Czech writer, this is my pronunciation, the Czech writer Miloš Benuš produced a radio play, Ovid's Return, in 1965 for Westdeutscher Rundfunk public radio station based in Cologne. Dr. Zustova, you yourself made a reference to Ovid in your acclaimed novel, The Silent Woman. The father of the main protagonist, Silva, after quoting a few verses from Ovid, remarks, the Roman poet's life ended sadly in exile. Her father says that he wants Silva to remember that quote from the English translation, whereas all other creatures walk with their heads bowed, looking at the ground, man has a face at his disposal with which to observe the horizon and a head with which he can look up at the stars. The context of these Ovidian lines is the account of the metamorphoses and the creation, or more precisely, the molding of mankind by Prometheus. Perhaps it is Ovid's exaltation of the human spirit that best describes the condition of a persecuted intellectual or artist who can both observe critically the horizon of the present and courageously envision a better future beyond the horizon. Thank you.
Any questions? questions or comments to any of our panelists? Yes.
I have a comment and a question. Well, first of all, thank you, everybody. Everything was very, very interesting, and thank you for quoting from my book. I would have never expected anything like that. I myself forgot the quote. I have a little question. Martin just told us about two well-known Czech dissidents, Patočka and Havel. And well, they are very well known, especially Havel, right? And Patočka is, everybody knows Patočka in the Czech context. Every intellectual knows him. And even out of the Czech context, he is very well known among philosophers. He is considered by many philosophers the best philosopher of the 20th century. Well, I would say that like the Eastern European dissidents are well known by now. The problem of the regime that was there, and what the role of the dissidents were, that is very clear in, let's say, the Western world now. But I think I would say that the Cuban problem is different. I live in Spain, and there are many Cubans there, and they all have the same complaint. Nobody understands what Cuba is. Nobody wants to know what Cuba is. And it's true, they don't. People don't. People want to think that there was like a great achievement by Fidel Castro. They don't want to think about Cuba as a totalitarian state because many intellectuals actually were in favor of Fidel Castro during several decades. And so it's their youth, and they don't want to give up on their youth now, right? Well, this is one of the many, many reasons. But I know many exiles and dissidents who are really very, very sad. They live in this constant sadness. I mean, Cubans, and you quoted Cabrera Infante. I know his wife. She's paranoid, and so are other writers like Zoe Valdez. And I would like to know, what do you think, Alejandro? What's the situation now? Do you think that this opening of the West will bring something positive to Cuban dissidents and exiles, or not?
Yeah, when you open a door, it's really positive, any door that you open. But specifically about Cuban artists, I don't think there's not like a big advantage. We have seen some advantage. I can give you the example of, we have invited Miami-Dade College and the film festival, some filmmakers. Last year we invited like young filmmakers. I think they are the avant-garde right now of the Cuban artists. But if you move to the painters and sculptors, they don't care about political anymore. They care about money, and that's it. In the 80s, they used to be really strong. We had a hope that generation was really doing a big statement about what was happening in Cuba, but they left to exile. They simply went away. Because I remember being in the last show of the Cuban artists in the 80s. It was called, in Spanish it's objeto esculturado, so it's the object as a sculpture or something like that. And there was a strong performance by this guy who ended up in prison. He took a Granma newspaper, the party's newspaper, he put it in the floor, He put down his pants and he made poop on the newspaper. That was really strong. And they did a lot of performance like that. But that ended. Now the carpinteros want money, and the other artists, that's what they're looking for. So they are simply in silence. They don't speak about politics. When you try to, Cacho is a friend of Fidel Castro, and he's a really good artist, a wonderful artist. But he's a friend of Fidel Castro. He's into politics, and he has everything. He has internet connection. He has this place where everybody goes and sits close to where Cacho lives, or where Cacho has his studio, and people try to connect with internet. But it's a sad story. You don't see the writers are in exile. Zoe and Renato Arena, who died in New York, who committed suicide in New York. Inside, maybe Leonardo Padura will be someone that is in some way interesting. But what is happening, my point of view is that the Cuban dictatorship really crushed the culture. They really crushed it. There's no consequence. Only in the movies you can see, only in cinema you can see some kind of hope. No literature, no painting. Theater, recently there was this film director and theater director, Juan Carlos Cremata, who put on this play of Ionesco, El Rey se muere, the king is dying, and he could only have it on the theater for 2 days, and that was it. Because someone said, the king that is not dying is Fidel Castro, so you're doing like something that we're not going to allow. So now he's a guy who used to do a lot of films and a lot of theater in Cuba. It's a no person. He doesn't exist anymore. They're really good at erasing people. They simply erase the person. I think with more efficiency that they did in the East and other countries. It's really sad, but that's what I see. With the exception of the filmmakers that really do hard documentaries and really good films, even this film, Juan de los Muertos, that is this zombies walking on Havana right now. That's a comedy, but it's really interesting because it's the whole Cuban population who are zombies. That's what he's trying to say. Things like that really work, but and even this filmmaker, he went to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, and he hasn't made anything anymore. That's it. Yeah. It's a sad situation for the Cuban. For the Cuban intellectuals and culture, I think we're in a dump right now. I can say that.
Any other questions, comments?
I'm not expert in Cuban matters, but honestly, don't believe that. I have read several interesting books, also Abiertos, written by independent journalists, maybe people who are less known than others, but certainly trying to fill the space with something. I think that in inner motivation of some people to resist in their own terms and to find some way how to survive existentially, I would say integral in that context, plus exist in Cuba. I'm not 100% sure that you are describing whole Cuban reality.
Can you give me another example? Is that guy being read by some people? Where did you read him? On the internet? On the online? People can't connect to the internet? People, who is this person? Who published this person? Even Leonardo Padura, the most famous writer in Cuba, hasn't been. It has been published day by day, with some suspicious, and they publish like 100 books and that's it. They disappear the books. Even that the guy most famous.
I'm not talking about official publishing houses, about some sort of samizdat as we were used, and there is a space for samizdat much bigger than ever before because of informational technologies of today.
But they're not connected. Remember that. Maybe now with Obama they will be connected, but not, they're not connected.
I have a question for you. In Cuba, the literacy rate,
The what?
literacy, the people education in Cuba,
It's really high.
it's very high,
Yeah.
isn't it,
What they
compared
didn't-
to, especially compared to the countries whose economical situation the same.
Yeah, because-
It's amazing.
Yeah, because in the beginning they made a big literacy campaign,
Mhm.
and then after that they told you this is the book that you have to read, but you can't read this book. That's the way it is.
But everybody.
You learn to
reads.
read,
Yes.
but you can read this book, but you can't read Guillermo Cabrera Infante. You're not allowed to read that. The
Yes.
government tells you
Yes.
what are you allowed to read.
Totalitarian-
What are you allowed to read?
Totalitarian regime, yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
it is.
Yes, but the education is good and your scientists are good.
It's not
especially
education.
the
It's
doctors.
indoctrination. It's not education.
Yeah,
It's not education.
yeah, okay, yes.
My question is for Mr. Rios. Since there seems to always be a focus, rightly so, on the Cuban exile condition, particularly in Latin America, right? However, during the 80s, there was a big exile that happened
Maria?
because of communism coming from Central America, Nicaragua, for example, a lot of exiles coming out of the Sandinista regime. Recently, Venezuela is another example of exile as well. Do you see any particular parallels, taking Nicaragua out of the way now because of its political transformation and Ortega's current way of doing politics, which is completely different from the 80s, but Venezuela in particular, is there any parallels that you see now that mimic the same conditions of exile, not only economically but also intellectually, that you saw or that you see in Cuba, comparing Venezuela in particular? And I think it's often a subject that is not very touched upon. I know that Cuba, because of the long history, not only of oppression against intellectual, economic, and also with the embargo and so forth, is the main focus when it comes to exile in Latin America. But there have been other examples that often seem to be overlooked. Do you agree with me, or is there something that you can add that perhaps I'm not aware of?
I will add that in the case of Cuba, a lot of the writers and artists who went to exiles sometimes died in exile because they weren't allowed to return. Maduro is not really a totalitarian regime. Writers from Venezuela come to the book fair that we do every year, and they return to Caracas, and they live there. A lot of them. A lot of singers, they prefer not to speak about what's happening in Venezuela.
The Cubans come here to Miami too, no?
Huh?
Cuban independent people come here to Miami too.
Oh yeah, lately. But when he's talking about the 80s, about Mariel generation, really a prestigious generation, like Arenas, like the Abreu brothers, like René Ariza, most of them couldn't return because they weren't allowed to return. So that's where I see the difference between Venezuela and Cuba.
Yes.
Yes.
Question. There's a question to Martin. You mentioned Charter 77, and it was a brainchild of intellectuals, basically. Can you tell us a little bit more about the dynamics between the document that was produced and the people who were producing it and the government there? What effects did it have?
I think that there was a significant similarity and difference between, let's say, our Czechoslovak Charter 77 and Polish Solidarność. Our project was certainly much more intellectual project. Solidarność was an independent labor movement with all advantages of large numbers and I would say bigger political waves. Czechs and Slovaks after 1968 were really looking for options. You had option either to conform with the regime and try to enter the social contract the regime was offering, to live without, I would say, too much of disturbance. No one was expecting that anyone would have believed in anything, but just to conform, to get coordinated with the line, or eventually to go to exile, to leave if you didn't like it so much. So the question was a third option. Patočka, I was quoting from the text that were certainly not published in these days. Havel's essay was only spread in samizdat, and Patočka's lecture from which I quoted also was not officially circulated. And it was actually his lecture series, I was one of the students, there, Plato and Europe, and in which he started that people are now depressed. They feel that they cannot live in identity with themselves. So the question is what they can do. And then Charter 77 was obviously a combination of this existential search for some sort of Socratic identity with yourself on the one hand, and on the other hand, opportunity offered by the international developments, Helsinki process, and discussion about human rights as well, lawyers and politicians law. Most Chartists were not lawyers, so for them, question of human rights was a question of their identity with themselves. So what happened was that there was 242 people originally, not a large group of people, but still some sort of public space opened among them. Human rights is rather responsibility for human rights of other people than your own entitlements. Was an interesting concept. And then a lot of independent activities and creativity was then part of this public space, sometimes crushed by the regime, sometimes allowed to do at least something. Some is that there was independent philosophy, they were in independent international communications. I think that now Cuban dissidents, how do you want to call them, are experiencing the same situation. And in the end of the day, obviously, we are looking for political alternatives, but our original plan was not to plan for some political action. We wanted only to live in a decent manner in that situation and to have a dialogue about things, whoever was ready to have a dialogue with us. So Charter 77 was all these terms like non-political politics, I think Adam Michnik was using at Václav Havel, was not that these people were, I would say, didn't want to have anything in common with politics. It was demonstrated later, but it was basically almost Socratic position, what Socrates was saying. First, care about your soul first, and then to start engage yourself in polis. So this type of dynamism, obviously not replicated. You cannot replicate Athens in the 20th century Czechoslovakia, but some sort of similar dynamics of human situation.
One more, yes.
So we've heard the experience of exile from the viewpoint of Eastern Europeans, from Cuba, the ancient perspective. I'd like the panel to, each one of you, to give me your thoughts about Edward Snowden and the experience of exile from the perspective of the United States of America and a prominent exile himself at the present time. I'd be interested to know your viewpoints on that.
Okay, I'll start. I was just yesterday I was talking to Asher Milbaro about him, and well, actually last year I was at the Penwell Voices Festival in New York, and there was like part of it. There was a discussion between Timothy Garth-Nash and Salman Rushdie. And so Timothy was saying that that Edward Snowden is a great hero of our time. And Rushdie's thesis was that, well, if he was the great hero of our times, he wouldn't be sitting in Moscow. Okay, so I really don't know, I must say. Actually, yesterday when we were talking about this with Usher, he said, we thought that we probably don't know everything, but I tend to think that he definitely was very courageous to do what he did. That it was something very good, that it's probably rather good than bad. But if he was like a real hero, he should stand a trial. That's my position.
Alejandro?
Yeah, I prefer not to comment on something that I really don't know very well. But before I finish, I want to go over some crushing of Cuban culture. We had a great movement of hip hop, and it doesn't exist anymore. We had this guy who did a performance with the two pigs, Fidel and Raúl, and he was in prison for 1 year. He did a show here in Miami, actually, and he was in prison and the day before President Obama got to Cuba. Even Paquito de Rivera, one of the most famous musicians in Cuba, one of the most famous Cuban musicians, has written like funny anti-Castro books, some of them memoirs, and they are not published in Cuba and they are prohibited in Cuba. So I only wanted to bring that so you know the effect, how effective are these the repression in the country where I come from.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I don't think that we should say anything very different from what is said about Edward Snowden. First of all, I don't know much about that. I also have to say that I'm from a diplomat, and I know that there is information that is, I would say, sensitive, and states like to protect it, and protection means that those who do things that are against the law really need to be made responsible for that. And I think there is a simple fact that Mr. Snowden violated the law by making this great service to the world. So I'm not sure that it is the case. I would like to, I would say, argue. I'm wishing him all the best. The strange thing that he sits in Moscow. That's a, I would say, a great question for me. And the problems of this world, I think, have not been resolved by the action of Mr. Snowden.
Do you have anything to say?
No, well, I guess maybe because I study antiquity, just that maybe after our lifetime,
Well,
like, you know, history will decide maybe the story.
well, from what I understand, thousands of years ago, or today, or Cuba, or Turkey, or Czechoslovakia, or the Socrates times, ancient Greece, the story is the same, suffering is the same, nothing changed for thousands of years. That's a physicist's conclusion. So, thank you very much for coming. And thank you to our panelists. They were wonderful.